Welcome to the sixth lecture in Module 4, and in this lecture we'll talk about collections, blocks, and iterators. Now, Ruby contains a number of collection classes, and collection classes are just collections of objects that allow you to store them in one convenient place and refer to them. The most important of these are the array and hash classes, and there's also a set class and a few others. There's a range class, but we'll primarily see the array and hash classes used in our Rails applications. Now, each of these collection classes includes the enumerable module as a mix-in. So these are included in those classes, and this allows these collection classes to share all of the methods that exist in enumerable. And the enumerable module provides something called an iterator, very important, and typically it's called the each method. And this is used to iterate through each and every item in a collection and perform operations on it as you iterate through them as well. So here's an example of an array that's used extensively in Rails controllers. And if you open up your blog application and look at the index method under the post controller, you'll see that it's a method, def index, and then the @posts. Recall that that @ symbol means that this is an instance variable, and post.all is an active record. Post is an active record object. .all returns all of the posts that are in your database and assigns them to that post's instance variable. And that post instance variable is an array. Very important to recognize that that is an array. So arrays hold collections of objects that are indexed starting at 0. So this is zero-based addressing. So if you want the first element in an array, you index location 0, 1, and so forth. With arrays, you can also store different types of elements. So here's an example. If you open up IRB and type A equal, the square bracket is how you open an array, and then you close it with the close square bracket. And notice in this case, this is a non-homogeneous array. I've got a decimal value there, I've got a string, as well as an integer value. And I show you there that if I index into the first location, A0, that gives me 33.3, which is the first thing in the array that I defined above. So there's a huge number of different methods that are provided with the array class. And if you want to see them, just type capital A, array, dot methods, and it'll give you all of the methods that exist for the array class. So here's a few of them. You can index a range. So if I want to go the second and third elements in that array, that I'd say A1 dot dot 2, and I get a range of elements returned to me. It actually returns a subarray, or it returns an array element, in fact. I can do A.sort on the array above that I have, and it would sort those elements. If I do sort with an exclamation point, then it's going to actually change the data in the array itself. If I want to see if the array includes a particular element, then that's this include method with the question mark. You can reverse the elements in the array by doing A.reverse, determine the length of the array, determine the first or last element. And then this next one, the less than sign, that's how you add another element to the array. So try this from IRB. Type in the array that I show you in this example and say A less than 5, and you'll add 5 to the end of that array. You can also treat an array as if it were a stack. So this is why you see these push and pop methods. If you want a stack, just create an array and just use push and pop, and you've got a stack. Now, here's here's these in use. So try these as I showed you this A less than 5. The other interesting one here is the third one down. If you look at this third one here, A minus 1, that allows you to index from the end of the array. So that would give me the last element in that array. So I've added a 5, and then I do A minus 1. It'll give me the last element in the array. So I encourage you to open up IRB and play with arrays a little bit. Now let's talk about hashes. A hash is just an associative array. We've seen arrays, and you index array according to an integer, 0, 1, 2, 3. With a hash, it's an associative array. In other words, rather than having an integer index, you have some other object to index some value. So you just get a key and a value. So for an array, that key is an integer. For a hash, it's any object. So here's an example. And notice the syntax is a little bit different than arrays. Rather than a square brace, you use a curly brace. So rather than a square bracket, it's a curly bracket. So here I'm creating a hash called phone, and I'm associating home with the number 1, mobile with the number 2, and work with the number 3. So you could do this. We've talked previously about the difference between strings and symbols. And it'd be better to actually create a hash with these symbols, because then if home were defined elsewhere in the program, it's not creating yet another string for it. So this is a more typical thing that you see, is to define hashes using symbols. If I create the one that I just showed you, this last one, and then go into IRB and type phone with the brackets home, it'll return the number 1. So it's associated the symbol home with the number 1. And if I want to know the key associated with 1, it'll return home. So that's how you get the key rather than the value. And if you want to just see if home exists as a key, then type key question mark and it'll return a true false value. And if you want to know if the value 1 exists, right, then you just type value with a question mark and it'll return true if that value exists as a part of your hash. So hashes, again, are used extensively in Ruby. And as you develop Rails application, you'll have opportunities to create, for example, the phone one I show you here. If you create a person and you'd like to be able to keep track of their phone numbers and you want to know what type of phone it is, you might create this exact hash. Now, how do you create multi-dimensional arrays or multi-dimensional hashes? Or you can have a hash where each element is an array, or vice versa. It's easy to do in Ruby. You just nest one inside of the other. Here's an example. ARY is an array, dimensional arrays or multi-dimensional hashes, or you can have a hash where each element is an array, or vice versa. It's easy to do in Ruby. You just nest one inside of the other. Here's an example. ARY is an array, and it's got red, green, blue, 1, 2, 3, alpha, beta, gamma. It's got 3 different arrays within it. So this is really an array that's got 3 arrays in it, and each of those arrays have 3 different columns, if you want to think of it that way. And you just index it as I show you here. So 2, 1 would give me in the 3rd row the second element. So it would return beta. Remember, again, the indexing starts at 0. So 2, 1 means 3rd row, second element. Now here's a hash, this HSH, and inside that hash I'm creating other hashes. In this case, I'm creating a Chicago as the key, and the value I'm storing is the nickname as well as the state that it belongs to. Done the same with New York. And so this hash has inside it another hash, and if I want to index into that, I say HSH Chicago for the string and the nickname, and it'll return the Windy City. So again, I encourage you to play around with these hashes as well to get a sense for how they work. Now let's talk about iterators. And in order to understand iterators, you first need to understand how blocks work in Ruby. And these are used extensively in Rails too, so very important to understand this. A block is just a bunch of lines of code that are enclosed in curly braces that can be passed to a method. So you can pass a block of code to a method. And we talked about this previously as an instance of, or an example of, functional programming. So using this feature, it's very easy to build code libraries which can delegate the functionality to these blocks. You can put off defining that functionality until some point later, or even dynamically define it and just pass code blocks into functions that have been previously defined. And an iterator is in fact an example of that. Now here's the most important rule to understand about blocks. A block can appear only in the source code if it's adjacent to the method call and on the same line as the method call's last parameter. Here's an example. So I'm creating a function called 3times, and it's got 3 yield statements in it. And the yield statement will just execute the block of code that's passed into that method. So next, I'm opening up IRB, and actually if you open up IRB, first define this function, and then now I'm invoking that method 3 times, and right after it, curly braces, that's a block of code that's being passed in to the method. That block of code just says puts hello. In other words, print string hello. And because there's 3 yield statements inside the method 3 times, it's going to execute that block of code 3 times. So if you execute this, it's going to print hello 3 times from the IRB control, from the IRB console. So try this out. I encourage you again. Again, let me iterate what's happening here. This block of code is being passed into the method 3 times, and the yield statement invokes that block of code, and it does it 3 times in this example. Now, given this, we can better understand now how iterators work in Ruby. All right, so as I've already mentioned, the loop structures in Ruby are rarely used. It's a lot more common to use iterators in Ruby to do looping structures. So the defining feature of an iterator is that it invokes a block of code, applying it to each element in a collection. So again, iterators are implemented over collections. And what happens when you invoke an iterator is it goes through each element in the collection and performs whatever block of code you pass in. So a collection that includes the enumerable module is in fact required to supply this each method. Otherwise, it can't use the enumerable method. And that method is required to yield the successive members of the collection. Here's an example. Iterators work, by the way, because you can pass parameters into blocks, and this is the example. So this is roughly how the each method works in the enumerable method. It works something very much like this. We've got this definition of the method each, and then there's a loop there that says for each item in the collection, and I say beside this, this is pseudocode because this is very roughly how things are implemented, yield, and then the item by item. If you remember on the previous slide, I said that the each method is required to yield each element in the collection. That's the line that's doing it. Yield, item, and then there's just ending that loop and then ending the method declaration. Let's try it out. Here's this array, which is again a collection that includes enumerable. So we've got, I'm defining this array A that's got 3 elements. And if I say A.each, and then I'm opening these curly brackets, I'm providing a block of code. And look at this block of code. It's got element between the pipe symbols and then puts element. This is how you pass parameters into blocks. And so you can think of this element as like a parameter that's a part of a method. And in the yield statement up above, that item is supplied to element, and then element is used in the rest of this definition in the block. So puts element, the item comes from the yield statement, is supplied to this element inside the pipe symbols, and then puts element prints out that element. And so if you do this, it'll actually go through each element in this array and print it out. Very common way of doing iteration in Ruby is through these iterators. Very rare that you see loops. Far more common that you see iterators. Here's an example. If you go to your Rails blog application again, open up the index in your view, open up index.html.erb, and you'll see this little snippet of code there. And this is a part of the table that's defined there, and you'll see table body, that's what that first tag is. And then remember that embedded Ruby, you create embedded Ruby by doing the less than sign, percent sign, then the percent greater than sign. And what that says is that everything enclosed between those 2 percent signs is Ruby code that should be executed in your view. Now recall what post was. Post was an array. So post.each do post is going to go through and iterate over that post array. And for each of them, you'll see we're creating a table row first and then table data. So we're printing the post title, post body, and then a link to show and a link to edit. And we're going through and we're doing that for each element in this array. So that's how embedded Ruby is being used, and an iterator is being implemented in your view using embedded Ruby. Now, one other thing I want to remind you is if you look at some of these lines for the table data, there's a percent equal. What happens again with embedded Ruby is that actually generates HTML code that gets inserted at that line. If there's no equal sign, It's just a control structure that's being executed. So here you have an iterator that's actually creating lines of HTML as it goes through this loop. Again, a very common thing to do in Rails applications is to use iterators in this fashion. So this completes the 6th and final lecture in Module 4.